"Keep away from the kennels, your grace. The girl carries cursed blood." Those were the first words Elder Croft spoke to me when I dismounted at Bracken Hollow's gates. Not a greeting, not a report on the harvest disputes I had ridden 3 days through Fenland missed to settle. A warning, delivered before I had wiped the mud from my boots. I remember studying Croft's face. He was a broad man, run to heaviness in the jaw, with the kind of eyes that calculate before they settle on an expression. He chose concern. It fit him poorly. "Cursed blood," I repeated. "Brennan's daughter." Croft lowered his voice as though the name itself might carry infection. "The trader's girl. She tends the hounds because no other work will have her near. We've kept her fed, kept her housed, mercy, your grace, more than most packs would show. But the blood is what it is." Behind him, the settlement spread out in the flat gray light of the fens. Bracken Hollow was a minor vassal holding 200 wolves at most, a timber great hall darkened by peat smoke, a ring of low stone cottages with moss climbing every wall. The air smelled of wet earth and standing water. Beyond the last cottage, the marshes stretched to a horizon that was neither sky nor land. I had come for a boundary dispute between Bracken Hollow and its neighbor Ashwick Moor. 3 days of hearings, perhaps 4, nothing remarkable. I had made this circuit to a dozen vassal packs that year, dispensing judgments, hearing grievances, inspecting stores. It was the dull, necessary work of holding a kingdom together. Dunhallow's authority rested not on force but on fairness, or it was supposed to. "Show me to the hall," I said. Croft bowed and led the way, still talking. His words tumbled out in the practiced cadence of a man who has rehearsed a story so often he believes it. Brennan, the former beta of Bracken Hollow, had been convicted of treason 12 years prior, conspiring with a rival pack, selling patrol routes, endangering the settlement's wolves. He was executed under Dunhallow's law. His daughter had been a child at the time. The pack had shown her mercy by allowing her to stay. But her blood, Croft insisted, was tainted. "She doesn't shift?" I asked. "Forbidden," Croft said, and something flickered behind his careful expression. "The elders agreed for the pack's safety. A cursed wolf is a danger to all." I filed that, a wolf forbidden from shifting. In 12 years of rule, I had heard that sentence applied exactly twice, both times to wolves convicted of attack, both times under my direct order. A child inheriting a sentence for her father's crime was not Dunhallow's law. It was Bracken Hollow's invention. I said nothing, but I looked toward the kennels. They sat at the far edge of the settlement, a long, low stone building with an open run enclosed by iron fencing, the kind built to house warhounds. I could hear the dogs from the courtyard, deep-chested barking, the scrape of heavy paws. Bracken Hollow bred marshland trackers, big, gray-coated animals with jaws like traps. They were useful dogs and notoriously difficult. My own kennel master in Dunhallow had once described them as half-feral on a good day. Through the fence, I could see a figure moving among them. She was slight against the bulk of the hounds, dark hair tied back with a strip of leather. Rough-spun clothing the kind servants wore dyed the color of mud. She was filling water troughs, and the dogs moved around her like a current around a stone, giving her space, then pressing close, then giving space again. Not one of them lunged. Not one snapped. A gray female the size of a small pony was lying on her side at the girl's feet, belly exposed, while the girl scratched behind the dog's ears with one hand and poured water with the other. I had bred hounds my entire life. I knew what trust looked like in an animal. It looked like that gray female's open belly. And then the girl turned, and I saw her face, and my wrists went warm. Not hot, not painful. A slow warmth, like holding a cup of something that had been brewed just for me, the heat soaking into my palms, settling into the thin skin over the pulse points. My hands opened at my sides. I stood still in the courtyard, mud on my boots, Croft still talking beside me, and felt my own blood recognize something my mind had not yet named. She did not see me. She turned back to the dogs, and the warmth faded to a low hum, present, patient, like a note held just below hearing. "Your Grace," Croft's voice carefully pitched, "the hall is this way." I went, but I remembered the warmth. The boundary dispute was tedious and straightforward. Ashwick Moor's beta claimed Bracken Hollow's trappers were working a stretch of marshland that had belonged to Ashwick since the old charter. Croft's people claimed the border had shifted with the river. Both produced maps drawn on oilskin, both swore on their bloodlines, and both were lying about different things. I listened, asked questions, compared the marks, and scheduled a surveying party for the following morning. That night, the hall was filled with Bracken Hollow's wolves for the welcome feast. Croft sat me at the head of the long table, piled the boards with smoked eel and root stew and dark bread, and toasted Dunhallow's justice with a cup of Fenland mead that tasted of peat and honey. I counted the faces in the hall, roughly 80 wolves, families included. Children ran between the benches. A few elders sat near Croft Hale, a thin man with quick, anxious hands, Dorrit, a woman with iron-gray hair who watched me with an expression I could not read. And at the edges of the room, the lower-ranking wolves, the workers, the single mothers, the young unmatched. Ilara was not among them. I noticed because I was looking. I told myself I was cataloging the pack's structure, identifying who was present and who was excluded. That was true. It was not the whole truth. "The kennel keeper," I said to Croft, keeping my voice even. "She doesn't eat with the pack." Croft's fork paused. "The girl eats in the kennels, Your Grace. It's her preference." "Her preference?" I let the word sit between us. "She keeps to herself, always has," Croft smiled. It was the kind of smile that covered a door being shut. "More comfortable with the dogs than with her own kind, if I'm honest. Some blood runs that way." Hale beside him nodded too quickly. Dorrit said nothing, but her hands tightened around her cup. I ate, I listened to the talk. I watched Croft steer the conversation away from the girl with the ease of long practice, and I filed that too. After the feast, I walked the settlement. The night was thick with marsh fog, the kind that erased the world 10 paces out. Torches guttered along the cottage walls. The sounds of the fens pressed close, the croak of frogs, the shush of reeds, the occasional hollow call of a night bird. The kennels were dark except for a single tallow candle burning in the doorway. I heard her voice before I saw her, low, steady, the cadence of someone telling a story to a creature that understood the tone, if not the words. I stopped at the fence. Through the fog, I could make out the shapes of the hounds, settled for the night. Most were lying down. A few sat upright, ears tilted toward the sound of her voice. She was sitting on an overturned bucket beside the gray female, her back against the kennel wall, her knees drawn up. The candle lit her from the side, one half of her face in warm light, the other in shadow. She was not beautiful in the way the court at Dunhallow would have understood. She was something more unsettling than that. She was composed. She had the kind of stillness that comes not from peace, but from having survived the absence of it. The stillness of someone who had learned, very young, that no one was coming to help, and had built her life accordingly. My wrists hummed. She looked up, saw me at the fence, did not startle, did not shrink. Her eyes met mine across the dark yard, and for a moment neither of us moved. "Your Grace," she said, not a question. A flat acknowledgement that the King of Dunhallow was standing at her kennel fence at an hour when decent people were in bed. "The hounds are calm," I said. It was the most neutral thing I could find. "They've been fed, they're tired." She scratched the gray female's ear. "They're simple creatures, food, rest, a hand that doesn't hit them, that's enough. Most handlers say they're unmanageable. Most handlers shout." She said it without judgment, the way you might observe that rain falls downward. "These dogs were bred to track through marsh and silence. A loud voice is the opposite of what they need." I leaned on the fence. The iron was cold through my sleeves. The warmth in my wrists had spread, a low, banked heat, the kind that lives in the embers after the fire has been left to breathe on its own. "You're Brennan's daughter," I said. Something crossed her face, not pain exactly. Recognition of a conversation she had endured 1,000 times in 1,000 variations, all of which ended the same way. She set her jaw and met my gaze. "I am. You know why I'm here. The Ashwick boundary. Elder Croft has been expecting you. He spent 3 days cleaning the hall. And warning me about you." She did not flinch. He would. I waited, giving her the space to say more. She did not take it. The gray hound shifted, pressing her nose into Ilara's palm, and the girl's hand moved absently, a slow, sure stroke along the dog's muzzle. "He says your blood is cursed," I said. "He says a great many things." "And what do you say?" She looked at me then, fully, directly, without the deference that every other wolf in Bracken Hollow had offered since I arrived. Her eyes were dark, steady, and utterly uncowed. I had met warriors who could not hold my gaze that long. "I say that I tend the kennels, Your Grace. I feed the hounds, I keep them sound, and I stay out of the pack's way. If that is cursed, then Bracken Hollow has a very low threshold for danger. Something in my chest shifted. Not my wolf had been quiet since I arrived, quieter than I had ever known him, as though he were holding his breath. Something else, something older. The warmth in my wrists pulsed once, sharp and certain, then settled. "Good night," I said. "Good night, Your Grace." I walked back through the fog and told myself I was here for a boundary dispute. The surveying party went out at dawn. I sent Garrett, my captain, with them and stayed behind. I told Garrett I wanted to inspect Bracken Hollow stores and records, standard for a circuit visit. That was true. It was not the reason I stayed. I began with the records. Bracken Hollow's archive was a stone room beneath the Great Hall, stacked with oilskin ledgers and ink-stained rolls of parchment. Most of it was mundane: harvest yields, wolf registrations, mating bonds recorded, births and deaths. I read through 12 years of entries with the patience of a man who had been trained to find the lie hiding inside the truth. Brennan's trial record was thin. One page, a single page for the conviction and execution of a beta, a wolf who had held the second highest rank in the settlement, who had served as Croft's predecessor's right hand for nearly a decade. One page. The charges were listed in Croft's handwriting: conspiracy with Ashwick Moore, selling patrol routes, endangering the pack. 2 witnesses named. A confession extracted, the page noted, under lawful duress. Lawful duress, the word sat in my gut like a stone. I pulled the ledgers from the years before Brennan's trial. They were unremarkable, but I read them anyway: the dull mathematics of pack life, the grain stores, the hunt tallies, the expenditures. And in the ledger from the year before Brennan's arrest, I found an entry in a different hand. The handwriting was smaller, neater, more precise than Croft's blunt strokes. It listed discrepancies in the pack's grain accounts: bushels purchased but not received, coins spent with no corresponding supply, payments made to traders who did not appear in any other record. The entry was unsigned, but the handwriting matched another document I found 3 ledgers deeper: a formal complaint addressed to the previous alpha of Bracken Hollow, detailing corruption among the elders, grain theft, falsified trade records, coin diverted. The complaint was signed Brennan, beta of Bracken Hollow. The complaint was dated 4 months before his arrest. I sat in the stone room beneath the Great Hall, surrounded by the smell of damp parchment and tallow, and felt a cold fury settle in my bones. Not the heat of rage, the cold of certainty. I pulled Brennan's trial record again. The 2 witnesses who had testified against him, Hale and Croft, both elders, both named in Brennan's corruption complaint. Their testimony was the only evidence. I closed the ledger. I sat there for a long time. I found Alara at the kennels that afternoon. She was stitching a tear in a leather lead, sitting on the stone step outside the kennel door, the gray female lying beside her with her head in Alara's lap. 2 younger hounds were play-fighting in the run, snapping at each other with more noise than intent. She stood when she saw me, the trained response, a vassal wolf rising for her king, but there was no submission in it. She stood the way she did everything, with the composure of someone who had learned to take nothing personally because the world had never offered her anything to take. "Your Grace." "Sit," I said, "please." She sat. I leaned against the fence, as I had the night before, and watched the young hounds wrestle. "Your father was beta of this pack," I said. "Yes." "And before his arrest, was he a good one?" She looked up, that same steady gaze. I wondered if she knew how unusual it was, a wolf meeting the alpha king's eyes without flinching. Most wolves, even strong ones, dropped their gaze within seconds. Instinct, the hierarchy written into the blood. She held mine as though she had never learned that she was supposed to look away. "He was the best man I have ever known," she said. "But you didn't come here to ask about my father." "I came here for a boundary dispute." "And stayed for the records room?" A pause. "I saw you go in this morning." Sharp, observant, the kind of mind that tracked the movements of the world around it, not from paranoia, but from the habit of living at its edges, where noticing things was the only protection available. "You know what I found?" I said. It was not a question. She heard it for what it was. "I know what my father wrote," she said quietly. "I know why he wrote it, and I know what happened 4 months later." "Tell me." She was silent for a moment. Her hands were still, the needle paused mid-stitch, the leather held loosely. The gray female shifted her head in Alara's lap. "My father kept careful records," she said. He noticed the grain discrepancies first, the numbers didn't match the stores. Then the payments. Coin going out with nothing coming in. He traced it to Croft and Hale. He filed a formal complaint with the Alpha. The Alpha before Croft took the seat. Alpha Marsh, a decent man, tired. He had been ill for 2 seasons. The complaint landed on his desk and he referred it to the Elders' Council for investigation. The same elders your father had accused. Yes. I said nothing. She did not need me to connect the pieces. She had lived inside them for 12 years. 4 months later, she continued, my father was arrested for treason. Croft and Hale testified that he had been selling patrol routes to Ashwick. A confession was obtained. My father was executed within the week. Within a week, my voice was flat. Dunhallow's law required a 30-day review for any capital sentence. I had never waived that review. No Alpha King in 3 generations had waived it. Bracken Hollow claimed emergency authority, an immediate threat to the pack. Her voice did not waver. Alpha Marsh died a month later. Croft assumed the seat. The complaint my father had filed disappeared. Not entirely, I said. He wrote it in the ledger, too. For the first time, something moved behind her composure. Not tears, not hope. Something more fragile than either, the recognition that someone after 12 years had seen what she had seen, what her father had been killed for seeing. He was meticulous, she said. He always said that records are harder to erase than people. The words hit me somewhere below the ribs. The warmth in my wrists flared, sudden, sharp, like a coal blown hot by a gust of wind, and I had to press my palms against the cold iron of the fence to keep steady. She noticed, her eyes dropped to my hands, then rose to my face. I saw the question form and watched her decide not to ask it. Your father was innocent, I said. Yes. And Croft framed him to bury the corruption complaint. Yes. And you have lived here for 12 years, in the kennels, forbidden from shifting, branded as cursed, because the men who murdered your father needed the lie to stand. She looked at me steadily. Yes, Your Grace. I stood there, my palms burning against the iron, the fog of the fens rolling in from the marshes, the hounds settling in the run behind her, and I felt something I had not felt in all my years of circuit judgments. Not anger. I had been angry before at petty cruelties and venal lords. This was different. This was the cold, precise weight of a king who has discovered that injustice has been living under his banner, wearing his authority like a borrowed cloak. And the woman who bore the cost of it is sitting on a kennel step, stitching a dog's lead with hands that have never trembled. I will hear the judgment tomorrow, I said. Not the boundary dispute, a different matter. She went still, the needle stopped. The gray female lifted her head, sensing the change. What matter, she asked. The matter of Brennan, former beta of Bracken Hollow. The matter of his trial, his conviction, and his execution. For one moment, her composure cracked. Not much. A tightening around the eyes, a breath drawn too quickly, a flicker of something that might have been grief or might have been the first tremor of a hope she had buried so deep she had forgotten where she put it. Your Grace, she said, and her voice was not quite steady, be careful. Croft has allies, Hale and others. They have held this pack for 12 years on the strength of that story. I am the Alpha King of Dunhallow, I said. I did not come to this fenland to be careful. She looked at me, and for the first time she almost smiled. Not quite, but the shadow of one, the ghost of what a smile would have been if she had not spent 12 years learning to live without them. Then I will be careful enough for both of us, she said. That evening I did not go to the hall for supper. I ate in the room Croft had given me, a narrow chamber above the great hall, stone walls, a narrow window overlooking the marshes. Garrett returned from the surveying party and reported that the boundary was, as I had suspected, exactly where the old charter placed it. Ashwick's claim was valid. Bracken Hollow's trappers had been encroaching. Croft won't like it, Garrett said. Croft will not like a great many things before this visit is over. I told Garrett what I had found. He listened without interruption, a good soldier's habit. When I finished, he sat in the chair across from me and rubbed his face with both hands. 12 years, he said. That girl has been living like that for 12 years. Yes. And Croft has been living very well. Garrett was quiet for a moment. You'll need more than a ledger entry and a missing complaint, Your Grace. You'll need the pack to see it. Croft holds them. Fear mostly, the same fear he's used to keep the girl in the kennels. Cursed blood. If the pack believes the curse is real, they'll side with Croft no matter what the records say. He was right. I had learned this on a dozen circuit visits. The difference between proving a thing and making people see it. Evidence lived in ledgers. Belief lived in the gut. Croft had spent 12 years building a gut-level fear of Brennan's blood, and no amount of bookkeeping would unwind it in a single hearing. Unless the proof was undeniable. Unless it was the kind of proof that did not require belief, because it bypassed belief entirely and spoke to the part of a wolf that knew what it knew before words could dress it up or strip it down. "Has anyone here ever seen her wolf?" I asked. Garrett shook his head. "Forbidden from shifting since she was a child. No one alive in this pack has seen her in wolf form." Croft's rule. Croft's rule. I sat in the narrow room and watched the marsh fog press against the window glass. The warmth in my wrists had not faded. It had settled, banked, patient, steady, as though it were waiting for something it already knew was coming. I sent Garrett to the hall with a message for Elder Croft. The Alpha King of Dunhollow would hold a formal judgment the following day, not on the boundary dispute, which was settled, but on a matter of pack justice that had come to his attention during the inspection of Bracken Hollow's records. All wolves were required to attend. Croft, I was told, received the message without expression. I could not sleep. The fenland night was loud, the frogs, the reeds, the water moving through the marshes in slow, black currents. I lay in the narrow bed and stared at the ceiling and tried to name what was happening in my body. The warmth was constant now. Not just in my wrists, it had spread to my chest, a low radiance behind my ribs, the kind of heat that lives in a hearth after the embers have been left to breathe all night. My wolf was quiet. Not silent, I could feel him there, present, alert, but quiet in a way I had never experienced, as though he were listening to a frequency I could not hear, as though he had recognized something and was waiting for the rest of me to catch up. I had read about this. Every alpha was taught the signs of the bond, the fated mate bond that was said to be rarer than a white luna, more certain than a blood oath, deeper than any chosen pairing. The texts described it differently. Heat, a pull, a howling, a stillness. None of them had mentioned this. This patient, accumulating warmth, like a tide that had been coming in for hours and was only now reaching the shore. This sense that my hands already knew the shape of her, that my blood had been spelling her name for years in a language I was only now learning to read. I pressed my palms together in the dark. The warmth flared, brief and sharp, and I would swear I felt a pulse that was not my own. Steady, calm, the heartbeat of someone sleeping in a kennel half a settlement away, dreaming of nothing, expecting nothing, a woman who had built a life inside the lie that had killed her father and had asked for nothing from anyone, not even the truth. I closed my eyes and held that pulse until it faded, and I did not sleep for a long time after. Morning came gray and damp, as all mornings did in the fens. Garrett had the surveying party's report written and sealed. I dressed in my formal circuit attire, the Dunhollow surcoat over chainmail, the gray cloak with the Highland granite brooch, the king's seal on a chain around my neck. I was not dressing for a boundary ruling. I was dressing for a judgment that would unmake 12 years of settled cruelty, and I wanted Bracken Hollow to see Dunhollow's full authority when it arrived. The hall filled slowly. Wolves trickled in from the cottages, from the workshops, from the fields, families settling on the long benches, children herded to the back, the elders taking their seats near the front. Croft sat in his usual chair, to the right of the judgment seat, with Hale beside him and Dorrit a few places down. Croft's face was composed. Hale's was not. The thin man's hands were moving, picking at a splinter on the table, adjusting his collar, tapping his knee. A man waiting for the ground to shift. I took the judgment seat and set the ledgers on the table before me. This hearing concerns the trial, conviction, and execution of Brennan, former baiter of Bracken Hollow, I said. The hall went quiet, not the gradual settling of conversation. A sudden, total silence, as though every wolf in the room had drawn breath at the same moment and held it. Croft did not move. His face stayed composed. But I saw his hands flatten on the tabletop, pressing down, as though he could hold the world in place by force. The Alpha King's authority supersedes all local proceedings, I continued. Under Dunhallow's charter, I have the right and the obligation to review any capital conviction carried out in a vassal territory. This review is 12 years overdue. Your Grace, Croft's voice was measured, careful. The matter of Brennan's treason was settled under emergency pack authority. The threat was immediate, the evidence clear, and the sentence was carried out in accordance with Bracken Hollow's internal. Bracken Hollow has no authority to execute a wolf without the 30-day review mandated by Dunhallow's charter. I kept my voice even. That review was never requested and never waived. The execution was unlawful. A murmur ran through the hall, wolves glancing at each other. Children hushed. Croft's jaw tightened, but he did not speak. I opened the first ledger. 4 months before Brennan's arrest, he filed a formal complaint with Alpha Marsh, accusing Elder Croft and Elder Hale of diverting pack funds, falsifying grain purchases, redirecting coin to unnamed traders, and enriching themselves at the pack's expense. The complaint was referred to the Elders' Council for investigation, the same elders named in the complaint. Hale's hands stopped moving. He went white. The complaint was subsequently removed from the records, I said. However, Brennan, a careful man, had entered the same findings in the pack's grain ledger in his own hand. That entry remains. I turned the ledger so the hall could see it. The neat, precise handwriting, the columns of numbers that did not add up, the payments to traders who had never delivered grain. 4 months after filing this complaint, I said, Brennan was arrested for treason. The sole evidence was the testimony of Elder Croft and Elder Hale, the men he had accused, and a confession obtained under what the trial record calls lawful duress. He was executed within a week. The hall was silent. I could hear the wind in the reeds outside, the creak of the old timber beams. The low, steady breathing of 200 wolves who were beginning to understand what had lived among them for 12 years. I have examined the trial record, I said. It is 1 page long. It contains no independent testimony, no physical evidence, and no explanation for why the 30-day review was not conducted. It is, in my judgment, insufficient to support a conviction for theft, much less treason, much less execution. Croft stood, his chair scraped against the stone floor. Your Grace, this is a settled matter. Brennan was a traitor, his blood. Sit down, Elder Croft. He sat not because he chose to, because the weight of the Alpha King's authority, the authority he had borrowed and bent and hidden behind for 12 years, pressed him down. The matter of Brennan's blood, I said, and my voice carried through the silent hall, brings me to the second part of this hearing. I turned to Garrett, who stood beside the hall's main door. Garrett opened it. Elara stood in the doorway. She was still in her rough-spun kennel clothes. Her hair was tied back. Her face was pale but composed, that same unshakable composure, the armor she had built out of 12 years of silence and dignity. She looked at the hall full of wolves who had avoided her, refused to eat near her, pulled their children from her path, called her cursed behind her back and to her face. She looked at them and she did not flinch. My wrists flared. The warmth surged, not banked anymore, not patient, but alive, rising like a fire catching new wood. I gripped the edge of the judgment table and held steady. Elara, daughter of Brennan, I said, and I heard my own voice change, heard the formal cadence of the king's judgment yield to something rougher, something that came from deeper in my chest. You have been forbidden from shifting for 12 years on the authority of Elder Croft. The stated reason was that your blood carries a taint, a curse inherited from your father. The hall watched, every eye, every breath held. There is no provision in Dunhallow's law, I said, for forbidding a wolf from shifting on the basis of bloodline. The prohibition was unlawful. I am lifting it now. A sound moved through the hall, not words, but a collective shift, a leaning forward, a held breath released and drawn again. Croft was on his feet. Your Grace, I must object, the girl is dangerous, her father's blood. Her father was innocent. I said it flat, final, the way you speak a truth that has waited too long. And his daughter has been punished for 12 years for a crime that never happened. I am ordering her to shift. I looked at Elara. She stood in the doorway of the hall where her father had once sat as Beta, where he had been dragged from his seat and accused and sentenced and taken out to die. She stood there, and her hands were steady at her sides, and her dark eyes met mine across the length of the room. You don't have to, I said, more quietly, for her, not for the hall. This is not a command, this is your right. It was taken from you, and I am giving it back. If you choose not to shift, I will respect that. But if you choose to, the hall will see what Croft has been hiding. She held my gaze, 5 seconds, 10. The hall was so silent I could hear the peat fire crackling in the hearth at the far wall. I have not shifted, she said, and her voice was clear and steady, in 12 years. Not because I was afraid of what I am, because they were. She stepped forward, into the center of the hall. Croft made a sound, a strangled half-word, the beginning of an objection that died in his throat. Hale pressed himself back in his chair as though he could push through the wall behind him. Dorrit, the iron-haired elder, leaned forward, her eyes bright. Ilara closed her eyes. What happened next, I will carry for the rest of my life. The shift began slowly, not the way most wolves shift, the quick shudder and blur of flesh becoming fur. This was different. This was like watching the sun rise. A light began in her chest, not around her, not on the surface, but inside, a radiance that pressed outward through her skin, turning her rough-spun clothes to shadow. The light was white, not silver, not gold. White, the white of fresh snow, the white of moonlight on still water, the white of something so pure it hurt to look at. And then she was the wolf. She stood in the center of the hall, a white Luna, the rarest form a wolf could take. The form that had not been seen in the Fenlands in living memory, that the old records spoke of in the language of legend, that was said to carry the blood of the first wolves, the original line, the line from which all alpha bloodlines descended. Her coat was luminous, not merely white, luminous, as though the light that had poured out of her during the shift had settled into her fur and stayed. She was smaller than the werewolves, leaner, but she held the hall's attention the way a flame holds a dark room. Every wolf in Bracken Hollow felt it. I could see it in their faces, the involuntary loosening of shoulders, the widened eyes, the parted lips. Not fear. Awe, the deep, blood-level recognition of something sacred. The white Luna turned her head and looked at me, and my wrists split open with light. Not pain, not heat. Light, warm, white gold pouring from the skin over my pulse points in 2 clean lines that wrapped around my wrists like bracelets forged from sunrise. The bond mark, the fated mate mark, blooming on my skin as though it had always been there, written in ink that was only now becoming visible. I looked down at my wrists. The light pulsed in time with my heartbeat, and across the hall on the white Luna's front legs, just above the paws in the thin skin where a wolf's pulse runs, the same light bloomed. The same mark, the same rhythm. Mine, she was mine. She had always been mine. The warmth I had felt since the moment I saw her at the kennel fence, the warmth in my wrists, the pulse that was not my own, the recognition that my blood had been singing to me for days, it was the bond. It had always been the bond. I stood up from the judgment seat. The chain of office swung against my chest. The ledgers lay open on the table. The hall was silent. 200 wolves, watching, breath held, as the Alpha King of Dunhollow stepped down from the dais and walked toward the white Luna standing in the center of their hall. My wolf, quiet for days, spoke for the first time. Not a howl, not a roar. A single word, clear as a bell struck in an empty room. Heard. I stopped 3 paces from the white Luna. The bond marks on my wrists pulsed warm and steady, matching the marks on her legs, matching the heartbeat I had felt through the dark last night. I looked into the wolf's eyes, dark, steady, the same eyes that had met mine across the kennel fence without flinching, the same eyes that had held mine when she told me her father was the best man she had ever known. I knelt. The Alpha King of Dunhollow knelt on the stone floor of a vassal pack's hall, before a white Luna who had been called cursed, before a woman who had spent 12 years in a kennel, because the men who killed her father needed the lie to hold. The hall erupted. Not in sound, in silence, a deeper silence than before. The silence of a room full of wolves whose entire understanding of the world has just been turned inside out. Croft's face was gray. Hale was shaking. And around them, the families, the workers, the mothers, the young wolves, I saw something shift, not all at once, not uniformly, but a slow, spreading understanding, the way light spreads across water when the clouds break. They were looking at the white Luna. They were looking at the bond marks. They were looking at their king on his knees. And they were beginning to see what had been hidden from them for 12 years. The white Luna shifted back. Ilara stood before me in her rough-spun clothes, her hair loose now, her face lit by the fading glow of the bond marks on her wrists. She looked down at me, the first person in the hall to look down at the Alpha King of Dunhollow, and her eyes were bright. Not with triumph, not with vindication, with something quieter than either. The look of a woman who has carried a truth alone for 12 years and is finally, not the only one who can see it. "Your Grace," she said. Her voice was steady, but there was a tremor beneath it, not weakness, but the vibration of something held too tightly for too long finally being allowed to open. "Elara, daughter of Brennan," I said, and my voice filled the hall, though I spoke only to her. "Your father was not a traitor. He was a man who told the truth, and he was murdered for it by men who preferred the lie. His name will be cleared in Dunhallow's records. His rank will be restored, and the men who condemned him will answer for it." I turned my head, still on my knees, and looked at Croft. The elder was standing. His chair had fallen behind him. His face had gone from gray to white, the white of a man who sees the structure he built his life upon cracking from the foundation up. Hale was beside him, trembling, his thin hands gripping the table's edge. "Elder Croft," I said, "Elder Hale, you are stripped of rank and title effective immediately. You will be escorted to Dunhallow to stand trial for the false conviction and unlawful execution of Beta Brennan, for the theft and misappropriation of Bracken Hollow's resources, and for the unlawful imprisonment of a wolf, forbidding her from shifting without Dunhallow's authority." Croft opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. "You can't, this pack is mine, I have held." "You have held a lie," I said, "and it has broken." Garrett stepped forward with 2 of my escort wolves. Croft looked at them, looked at me, looked at the hall full of his own pack members, and found no allies. Not one wolf moved to defend him. Not one voice rose. The pack that had feared him for 12 years watched him in silence, and in that silence was the judgment that no formal sentence could match. Hale went quietly. Croft did not. He was still talking when Garrett led him from the hall, still insisting, still explaining, still reaching for the words that had held everything in place for 12 years. But the words had lost their power. The white Luna had burned them away. The hall was quiet after they left. The wolves remained in their seats. No one spoke. They were looking at Elara, standing in the center of the hall in her kennel keeper's clothes, with the bond marks fading to a soft glow on her wrists, her father's name on the king's lips, and the whole rotten architecture of their fear lying in pieces at her feet. I rose from my knees. I stood before her, and the bond hummed between us. That warm, patient thing that had been waiting since the moment I rode through Bracken Hollow's gates, that had known what I did not, that had led me to the kennels and kept me awake and burned in my wrists while I read ledgers in a stone room beneath a hall built on a dead man's silence. "Elara," I said. She looked up at me. Close now. Close enough that I could see the faint flush on her skin where the shift's glow had not yet faded, the wet brightness in her eyes that she was fighting to hold back, the strength in her jaw and the gentleness in her hands, and the 12 years of unbroken dignity that had made her who she was. "I am not going to claim you," I said. "Not like this, not in this hall. Not as a king's pronouncement." She blinked. Something shifted in her expression, surprise, perhaps, or the echo of surprise, in a woman who had trained herself not to expect anything. "The bond is real," I said. "You felt it." "I felt it," she said, quietly, "since the first night at the fence." "So did I." I held out my hand, open, palm up, the bond mark glowing softly on my wrist. Not a command, an offer. "But I will not take your choice. You've had enough taken from you. If you want to walk out of this hall and back to the kennels, I will clear your father's name and leave you in peace. If you want to come to Dunhallow on your terms in your time, the door is open. I am asking, not commanding." She looked at my hand. Then she looked at the hall, at the wolves who had avoided her, at the empty chairs where Croft and Hale had sat, at the table where her father had once kept the records that killed him and saved her. She looked at all of it, and I watched her weigh it. "I have conditions," she said. I almost smiled. "Tell me." "My father's name cleared, publicly, in Dunhallow's records and in Bracken Hollow's. I want his rank restored and his story told correctly, not a pardon, because a pardon implies guilt. A declaration of innocence." "Done." The pack's grain stores audited. Every year Croft held the seat. The stolen coin accounted for. If there are debts owed to this pack, they are paid. "Done." "And I bring the hounds." Something broke open in my chest. Not the bond was already open, already humming, already warm. Something older. Something that had nothing to do with destiny or magic, and everything to do with the specific, irreplaceable reality of a woman who, in the moment she was offered a kingdom, thought first of her dogs. The kennels at Dunhollow, I said, are twice the size of these, and the hounds there are poorly trained. They could use a steady hand. She looked at me, and she took my hand. The bond marks flared, both wrists, both of ours, a warm white-gold light that filled the space between our palms and spread outward, illuminating the stone floor, the old timber beams, the faces of every wolf in the hall. It was not dramatic. It was not a storm or a roar or a trembling of the earth. It was warm. It was certain. It was the quiet, undeniable proof of a bond that had been waiting 12 years for the lie to clear so it could finally be seen. The pack moved. Not all at once. Dorrit first, the iron-haired elder, rose from her seat, stepped into the aisle and bowed, deep, formal, the bow of a wolf acknowledging a Luna. Then a young mother near the back, pulling her children close, bowing with them. Then a hunter near the door. Then another. Then another. One by one, the wolves of Bracken Hollow, the pack that had called her cursed, avoided her table, pulled their children from her shadow, bowed to the white Luna standing in their hall with the Alpha King's hand in hers, and her father's name cleared on his lips. Elara watched them. Her hand was firm in mine. Her face was wet, quietly, without sound, the tears she had not allowed herself for 12 years finally falling in a hall where there was no one left to punish her for them. I did not wipe them away. They were hers. They had been earned, and they were not mine to take. We left Bracken Hollow 2 days later. The boundary was settled in Ashwick's favor. Croft and Hale were in my escort's custody. Dorrit, the iron-haired elder, was appointed interim pack leader until Dunhollow could send a proper beta, a role she accepted with a curt nod and an expression that suggested she had been waiting 12 years for someone to ask. The hounds came with us. All of them. The gray female, the young fighters, the old tracker who could barely see but followed Elara's voice like a compass needle following north. Garrett's horse was deeply unimpressed. My own mount took one look at the procession of marsh dogs trotting behind Elara's borrowed mare and snorted in a way that I chose to interpret as approval. The ride back to Dunhollow took 3 days. We followed the old Highland road out of the fenlands, up through the peat moors, into the granite country where the wind tasted of heather, and the sky opened from the flat gray ceiling of the marshes into something vast and blue. Elara rode beside me. She did not speak much. She was not, I was learning, a woman who filled silence for the sake of filling it. She spoke when she had something to say, and the rest of the time she observed. The landscape, the horses, the hounds, the men in my escort who were trying very hard not to stare at the white Luna riding next to their king. On the second evening, we camped on a high moor with the whole of the fenlands spread out behind us and the first gray towers of Dunhollow visible on the northern horizon. Elara fed the hounds and settled them, then came to the fire where I was sitting with Garrett's report. "You knew," she said. I looked up, knew what? "Before the hearing, before you ordered me to shift, you knew what I was." I considered the question. I suspected. "How?" I held up my wrist. The bond mark was a faint tracery now, not glowing, but visible, etched into the skin like a scar made of gold. "This started the moment I saw you at the kennel fence. I didn't know what it was, not at first. I knew something in me recognized something in you. I knew the hounds trusted you, and hounds don't lie. I knew your father's records didn't match Croft's story. And I knew," I paused. "I knew that when I stood near you, my hands felt like they had come home." She sat down across the fire from me. The flames lit her face, one side warm, one side in shadow, the same way the kennel candle had lit her the first night. She was still wearing the rough-spun clothes. I had offered her better. She had declined. "These are mine," she had said in a tone that closed the subject. "I was afraid," she said, "of shifting, of what would happen after, not the shift itself. I knew what I was. My father told me when I was very young. He said I carried the old blood, the first line. He said it was a gift and that I should never be ashamed of it." She paused. "He also said there would be people who would be afraid of it. He was right about that, too. He was right about most things, from what I can see. He was right about everything." Her voice was quiet, but there was no tremor in it. The tears in the hall had been a breaking of a dam that needed breaking. Now the water ran clear. "He told me the truth about Croft 3 weeks before they arrested him. He sat me down in the kitchen, I was 10, and he said, 'Elara, I have done something that may get me into trouble. I have told the truth about powerful men, and powerful men do not forgive that easily. If something happens to me, remember, the records are in the ledger. The truth is in the grain tallies, and you are not what they will say you are.'" The fire crackled. The moor wind pressed against us, carrying the scent of heather and wet stone. The hounds were quiet, settled in a pile of fur and warmth 20 paces from the fire, the gray female's nose resting on her paws. "He was a brave man," I said. "He was a good man. Brave is what good people become when the world gives them no other option." I looked at her across the fire, this woman who had spent 12 years in a kennel, who had been called cursed and untouchable, who had never once stopped being exactly who her father raised her to be. And I understood with a certainty that went deeper than the bond mark on my wrist that I was not rescuing her. I had never been rescuing her. She had rescued herself, had kept herself whole, intact, unbroken, through a decade of cruelty that would have hollowed out a lesser soul. What I had done was clear the rubble. She had been standing the whole time. "When we reach Dunhallow," I said, "I would like you to meet with my records keeper. There are 12 years of Bracken Hollow's accounts to audit, and I suspect you know your father's system better than anyone alive." She looked at me sharply. Then, for the first time since I had known her, she laughed. It was a small sound, surprised out of her, as though she had forgotten she could make it. The gray female lifted her head at the sound, ears pricked, and I swear the old dog's tail moved. "You're asking me to do bookkeeping," she said. "I'm asking you to finish what your father started." She held my gaze across the fire. The bond hummed between us, that warm, steady pulse, patient and sure, the heartbeat of something that had waited 12 years and would wait 12 more if it had to, because it was not going anywhere, because it had never been going anywhere, because it had always been here, written in the blood, waiting for the lie to clear. "I'll need clean ledgers," she said, "and better ink than whatever Croft was using. That man's penmanship was an insult to parchment." "You'll have both." She nodded. The firelight caught the bond mark on her wrist, that faint gold tracery, the twin of mine, the proof that destiny does not forget, even when the world tries very hard to make it. We reached Dunhallow on the 3rd day, in the late afternoon, when the Highland sun broke through the clouds and turned the granite walls to honey. The castle was not large as castles go, a Highland keep built for weather and war, with thick walls and narrow windows and a great hall that smelled of wood smoke and pine. But the kennels were good. I had not lied about that. Stone-built, well-drained, twice the size of Bracken Hollow's, with a proper run and a covered area for winter. Ilara walked through them in silence, the hounds milling around her feet, and nodded once. "These will do," she said. The weeks that followed were not a love story in the way the bards would tell it. There was no dramatic courtship, no agonized declarations, no midnight rides through the rain. There was something better. There was the slow, daily work of two people learning each other, not through grand gestures, but through the small, accumulating evidence of compatibility. Ilara took over the records audit with the precision of a woman who had inherited her father's mind and 12 years of sharpened patience. She found the discrepancies in Bracken Hollow's accounts within a week. Croft had stolen nearly a third of the settlement's grain revenue over the course of a decade, laundered through fictitious traders. The evidence was meticulous, irrefutable. It went into the trial file alongside Brennan's original complaint and the ledger entries that had survived. And when Croft stood before Dunhallow's court, the case against him was so thorough that his own appointed advocate offered no defense. Brennan's name was cleared, not pardoned, cleared. The Declaration of Innocence was read in Dunhallow's great hall and sent by courier to every vassal pack in the kingdom. Ilara stood in the hall when it was read, and she did not cry. She stood straight, her hands at her sides, her chin level, and she listened to her father's name spoken with honor for the first time in 12 years. When it was done, she walked to the records room and wrote the declaration into the Dunhallow ledger in her own hand, the same neat, precise handwriting her father had used. I watched her from the doorway. She did not know I was there. The bond mark on my wrist pulsed warm. The hounds settled into Dunhallow's kennels as though they had always been there. The gray female adopted a spot by the great hall's hearth and refused to move for anyone except Ilara. My own hunting dogs, after an initial standoff that involved a great deal of stiff-legged posturing and exactly one terrified yelp from my best tracker, accepted the newcomers with the grudging tolerance of dogs who recognize a superior handler when they see one. Ilara ate in the great hall. Not because I asked her to, because the pack at Dunhallow, having heard the story of the White Luna and the cleared name and the bond marks in the Fenland Hall, had decided, collectively, that the woman who had brought 13 marsh hounds into their castle and reorganized their grain records in a week was someone they wanted at their table. She sat beside me, not across from me the way she had sat across the fire on the moor. Beside me, close enough that I could feel the warmth of the bond between our wrists, his and hers, gold tracery on skin, pulsing in time with a shared heartbeat that neither of us had asked for and neither of us would trade. One evening, after the hall had emptied and the fire had burned low, she turned to me and said, "You knelt." I did, in front of the entire pack, the Alpha King of Dunhollow on his knees. I am aware. Why? I considered the question. I had thought about it many times in the weeks since Bracken Hollow, lying awake in the early hours, listening to the wind against the Highland stone, feeling the bond mark pulse on my wrist. Because you had spent 12 years standing, I said, and no one had ever knelt for you, because the men who should have protected you used their authority to destroy your father and imprison you. Because you walked into that hall in Kennel Keeper's clothes and shifted into the purest form I have ever seen, and you did it not to prove yourself to anyone, but because it was your right. And because I turned my wrist over, letting the bond mark catch the firelight. Because when I saw you in that form, my whole body knew what my mind had been trying to understand since I first touched that fence. You were not the cursed girl they told me about. You were the reason I came. She looked at the bond mark on my wrist, then at hers, then at me. I didn't need you to save me, she said. I know. I had survived 12 years without a king's intervention. I know that too. But she paused. The composure that had held her through a decade of cruelty, through a public shift, through a judgment that remade her world, trembled at the edges. I am glad you came. I took her hand. The bond marks aligned wrist to wrist, gold to gold, the twin lines of destiny meeting in the space between our palms. The warmth was not a flare this time. It was a settling, the deep, quiet heat of a fire that has found its hearth and will not go out. I will always come, I said. And I will always kneel, not because you are weak, because you deserve a king who knows when to put his crown aside. She leaned into me, not a collapse, a choice. The deliberate, dignified choice of a woman who had spent 12 years holding herself upright, and was now, for the first time, allowing herself to rest against someone she trusted to hold steady. The gray female sighed in her sleep by the hearth. The fire settled. The Highland wind moved against the stone walls of Dunhollow, and the bond marks pulsed between us, warm and certain, the quiet proof of a destiny that had waited 12 years and found exactly what it was looking for. Months later, I found something in the records room. Ilara had reorganized the entire archive, Dunhollow's records, Bracken Hollow's recovered ledgers, the audited accounts, the trial transcripts. Everything was catalogued, cross-referenced, and filed in her father's system, neat, precise, ruthlessly logical. She had a gift for it, the same gift he had, the ability to see the story that the numbers tell when the numbers are allowed to speak honestly. But tucked inside the back cover of the oldest Bracken Hollow ledger, the one from the year before Brennan's arrest, I found a folded piece of parchment. It was old, creased, softened by years of being carried and read and carried again. The handwriting was Brennan's. It was a letter to Ilara, written from the date on the night before his arrest. He must have known it was coming. He had hidden it in the one place he trusted her to find, inside the records. I did not read it. It was not mine. I brought it to her in the kennels, where she was brushing the gray female's coat with the same steady, gentle hands that had first drawn me to the fence. I held it out, and I told her where I found it. She took it, looked at the handwriting, and her composure, that beautiful, hard-won 12-year armor, cracked open, and she wept. Not the silent tears of the hall at Bracken Hollow. Real weeping. The sound of a daughter holding her father's last words in hands that had waited 12 years to receive them. I sat beside her on the kennel step. The gray female pressed her nose into Ilara's knee. The hounds gathered close, the way hounds do when someone they love is hurting, not with understanding, but with presence. The simple, honest presence of creatures who know that being near is enough. I did not ask what the letter said. I did not speak. I put my hand on her back between her shoulders, steady, warm, and I stayed. She read it, she folded it, she pressed it to her chest. He knew, she said after a long time. He knew they were coming. He wrote that the truth was in the ledger and that someday someone would find it. He said, her voice caught. He said to take care of the hounds. I looked at the hounds, at the gray female whose nose was still pressed into Ilara's knee, At the old tracker, half-blind, lying in a patch of sun by the kennel door. At the young fighters sprawled in the run, watching us with calm, trusting eyes. "You did," I said. She leaned into me. I held her. The bond marks pulsed warm on both our wrists, and the kennel smelled of straw and dog and the clean Highland wind. And somewhere in the back of an old ledger, a brave man's truth had finally come home.